So with no more ado, let me say I've got great pleasure in introducing Alex Chalk, who's the Parliamentary Under Secretary of State for Justice today. As those of you who tuned in early will know, Alex is MP for Cheltenham, but not the part of Cheltenham where Nina revealed that she was born. And he's been MP since 2015. Prior to that, he's a barrister by training and has 14 years experience, specialising in counter-terrorism, homicide and serious fraud cases. He was appointed to his current role in February 2020, and he has a list of responsibilities which include race disparity, which include legal aid and victims and witnesses, domestic abuse, family justice, human rights, amongst other areas. So a really important, so far as our particular areas of interest, a really important brief that he holds. Alex has also previously appeared has been a member of the Justice Select Committee, where a number of us will have encountered him. Alex, the floor is yours.
John, thank you very much. First of all, can you hear me okay? Thumbs up will do. Lovely. Okay, well, you were kind enough to welcome me in that introduction, but I really wanted to say that the pleasure is all mine. I am so thrilled to be speaking to you this morning because I do know this organisation, I know the value of it, and we feel that the alliance which creates networks, which distills expert insights, is really important to government. And I know that from both sides of the fence as a backbencher, but now also in government myself. So can I just say that we welcome the work that you do. I'm really genuinely delighted to be saying a few words, and thank you for inviting me. So I really want to be particularly on receive rather than transmit. So I'm going to say a few words just to set out a bit of background, and I hope trigger some questions, but then really the business end of this should come in the questions if at all possible. So let me just start with some background. So John was mentioning my background as a criminal barrister, and I just want to dwell on that very, very briefly, only because I think it allows me to distill a couple of points which are critical when looking at this whole issue of race disparity within the criminal justice system. So my background, as you indicated, was particularly in terrorism, homicide and serious fraud and that sort of thing. Now that's important because it instilled in me, first of all, a deep love of the criminal justice system, not just the majesty of the law and all that sort of thing, but this critical issue about how you strike the balance between the powers of the state, an overweening and mighty state on the one hand, and the rights of the individual to do what fundamentally we're all interested in, is to have a system which convicts the guilty and acquits the innocent. And any of us who've worked within that system know that you need an adversarial system to tease out frailties in the prosecution case, and that is critically important. So, but by way of background, the sorts of cases that I was sometimes involved with is I, for example, prosecuted somebody who might have been a far-right extremist. I prosecuted terrorist bomb plots of people who travelled from Birmingham up to, where was it, Dewsbury, to go and blow up Tommy Robinson, for example. They didn't do it because they got the timing wrong, but that's a whole other story. Prosecuted a group of young men in Edgware Road who were trying to stoke up Sunni Shia extremism. They were followers of Anjem Chowdhury. Equally, I've defended a young black male accused under the doctrine of joint enterprise of being a murderer. So although charged as a principal, accused of being an accessory in respect of violence in West London. He was acquitted of that as I defended him, because we said, listen, you've effectively stuck him on a bill here. You've charged him as a murderer. He's nothing of the sort. Or a young woman, a young Muslim woman, accused of being in possession of firearms, which under pressure she had held on to at the behest of someone who was close to her culturally, but also in a relationship. So the reason why that's important is because the things which I divine from that is that we can spend a lot of time in government talking about this, that, or the other, about how we're going to address race disparity in the criminal justice system. But let me tell you, there are some fundamental things you've got to get right. First of all, you've got to have a jury system. Okay, so that is an extremely important part of the system to ensure that the bedrock of fairness comes from having 12 people drawn from the community. I think that's a really important point. Second, I think it's important to have barristers who prosecute and defend. So in other words, you know, if you're a prosecutor and you're sitting there and you've got material in front of you, which might reasonably be expected to be of assistance to a person, reasonably expected assistance to the defense, or might reasonably be considered to undermine the case of the prosecution, well, my goodness, you hand that over. And you hand it over because you know what it's like to defend. You know what it means to be prosecuted by a fair prosecutor or somebody who's less fair. So that's really important to people who prosecute and defend. And forgive me for stating the bleeding obvious, but it always bears emphasis, an independent judiciary who are of unimpeachable integrity. So those are three pillars of a criminal justice system which you have to have in place, without which any initiatives that we look at are pushing on a piece of rope. Let me just say a couple of other points by way of background. So yes, we're talking about the Criminal Justice Alliance, but as John alluded to, my policy areas extend well beyond that. So they extend into family law, domestic abuse and violence. I've just been with the Home Office taking through the domestic abuse bill, but legal aid, important, victims as well as race disparity. And so one of the points I really want to underscore is that when we look at the criminal justice system, the reality is a lot of what happens in the criminal courts has got connected and related elements which come into play in respect of family courts, for example. And so we need to consider this in the round. So just by way of example, one of the things we're looking at is this. So we commissioned a harms panel to look into how the family courts work. Are people able to get justice there? Because guess what? If people don't feel they can get justice in the family court, does it make it more likely that they will think ill of the system of justice beyond that in the criminal justice sphere? Or if they feel that they've been dealt an injustice, might it make them more likely to rail against authority, to rail against the system and find themselves in a scrape? So of course we look at the criminal justice system, but it would be a great mistake to look at it completely in isolation. I don't think any talk about this could fail to discuss the issue of the brutal, apparent as it would seem, murder of George Floyd. And of course, we have to let the system take its course. But my goodness, that was something that was so horrifying for anyone who viewed that footage, and the response that it has rightly attracted in the UK has caused us all to pause and think and to reflect. And I suppose the key takeaways are, one, on the other hand, that it's shocking in its own right, and we look to the US justice system to play that through, but we inevitably can't say too much about that. But the thing that really has resonated with me is that it's not enough to talk about bias, but you have to look at the perception of bias. That is a critically important point. And for those who are practitioners, whether you are in the criminal justice field or perhaps in judicial review or whatever it is, it's well known that decisions can be challenged, not just because there was a suggestion that the judge may or may not have been biased, but that there was a perception of bias, even if there was none, if that makes sense. That's a really important point, because I think you carry that over into the criminal justice system. It's not just that it's got to be fair in a specific case, but that it's got to be perceived to be fair. And that's a very, very important point. And so whilst there is a need to commission at these critical moments exercises which always get attention, we've got to have long-term methodical work which looks to embed equality into services and values at the front line. And so we need to bring about positive changes that have an impact, but crucially this, have a perceptible impact on BAME people. And it's clear that's not happening quickly enough, but there is more to do. There is further to go. And I want to talk a little bit about that, if I may, because one of the things that when I took this job in February, within a couple of weeks, I had read the Lamy review, which if you haven't read it, I've got a copy of it here, my annotated version. I commend it to you with its 35 recommendations. And I suppose there are 35 recommendations, but the key thing that jumped out for me from that, and the one which is the takeaway and which I think must underpin the work going forward, is essentially this one at recommendation 4, and that's the principle of explain or reform. In other words, very simply, either you can explain the situation which seems to create some sort of disparity, and there may be a reason for it, and you can justify it, or you've got to change. And that's the golden thread, really, which runs through the report. And when I said before about perceptions, one of the things also that I really feel that we have to address is that there are a lot of people who might say to themselves, do you know what? I'm a pretty fair-minded kind of person. There's nothing to see here. We in the courts are fair-minded. There's no problem. But often people don't necessarily realize, and it's not necessarily their fault, but they haven't been confronted by the data that makes it clear that there's a problem that needs to be explained or changed. So what are the tools then that we can bring to bear? Well, critically, if I had a single point that I was going to land, I think it's about transparency of data. In other words, allowing us to be confronted with a spotlight shone on the very issue that needs to be addressed. So we can't simply waltz through our day-to-day professional lives saying, nothing to see here. We have to be shown what there is and then respond accordingly. So one of the things that's been very important in that regard is the creation of the race disparity disparity unit, which you may recall that Theresa May set up. And it originally had a very simple, modest brief, a one-off audit of government data sets where ethnicity was reported. But it soon became clear that its work was so valuable that it needed to be sustained. And so that has been continued. So despite it being a small unit, it's already raised the bar for a number of departments who weren't thinking much about race previously. And it brings together a more comprehensive and concrete picture of how there are disparities in education, health, housing, or justice services, but how those then fit together to shape the lives of BAME people. And that unit is now based in the Cabinet Office, which those of you who aren't necessarily political nerds, let me just say that this is the center of government which tries to coordinate across government, the really tricky issues which it tries to drive forward. But the thing in some ways that I'm most positive and optimistic about, bear in mind this business about the explain or reform, recommendation 4, is, and if there's one thing as a result of this talk that I would invite you to go and look at, it is, I'm looking at it on my phone now, ethnicity, facts and figures. Okay, so this is something which has been posted, I'm looking at it, I'm digging it up on my phone now. But if you look at it, I'm tempted to show you now, but if you go to the website, gov.uk website, and you go to crime, justice and the law, if I don't drop my phone, and if you look here, you've got data on policing, crime, sentencing and prisons, you probably can't see. But if you go to policing, it will tell you, for example, I go to stop and search. And on this, it will give you figures by ethnicity over time, by ethnicity and area, by ethnicity and legislation, plus all the methodology and so on. It is the single most powerful tool, it seems to me, in trying to push this forward. Because as I said before, we have to be challenged about our assumptions, and there has to be a spotlight shone on it. So the ethnicity, facts and figures, do have a look at it. I think that's really important. Third thing I wanted to mention is the Criminal Justice System Race and Ethnicity Board. So that was set up in January 2018, and it works like other boards in government, 22 members, chaired by Ministry of Justice at Director General level. And it's there to hold the agencies and their senior staff to account on their performance. And it's something that we readily do in other parts of our jobs we consider important, but needs to go much further down organisations with respect to race, where there are measurable, persistent disparities. So in other words, got the data, then you've got the Race and Ethnicity Board to actually start to drill down on that data and hold other agencies and parts of government to account. And it's been instrumental in bringing about changes that were not a part of the Lamy review. So for example, the drive to improve practice within Gypsy, Roma and travellers, and the guidance being developed on commissioning services for BAME victims of crime. Let me just say, because I've gone on for a bit of time now, just a couple of quick priorities. So where do we go from here? Critically important in respect of the Lamy review is we've got to finish that off. So the total of 35 recommendations, I can talk to you about progress in respect of each one if you're interested in the granular detail. But the bottom line is this: within 12 months, we hope and expect to have squared off 11 of the 17 remaining, and then 6 as quickly as possible thereafter. And I should make clear, as I said to David himself actually in the in the chamber that there are some where it's not practical to go to the specific letter, but we've got to deliver on the spirit of it. And there's some really important and exciting things that we're doing. Other thing that I want to mention in terms of priorities is youth justice. And I saw that Jeremy is on the line as well. And I had a very, very useful conversation with him and others, the panel that he helps to coordinate. And youth justice is important because, forgive me for stating the obvious, but anybody who's been a practitioner in the courts knows that when you're standing in front of a judge and you're doing a plea in mitigation, if you're able to say, look, this is a young person, you should be giving him a chance. It's usually a him, not always, of course, giving him a chance, and therefore he should be able to go on this course and be rehabilitated. That's one of the most powerful submissions you can make. But equally, we've got to try to ensure that we deal with these issues of prevention in the first place. Now, I know that that is a point that is as old as the hills. People have been saying that since Noah was a lad. But what is exciting for me at the moment is that there is a recognition that we've got to work across government so that we try and identify some of these issues upstream. So that means working, when we talk about a levelling up agenda, as the Prime Minister has, that's got to be levelling up demographically as well as geographically. In other words, not just about saying that you've got to have a levelling up agenda so far as the northeast of England is concerned, as opposed to just the southeast. We need to ensure that that operates across our society as well. And so, although it sounds like terrible civil service jargon about a joined up approach, that is precisely what we want to deliver, underpinned, as I've indicated thus far, by data, transparency, and accountability. Because it's no good having aspiration, you've got to have the machinery to deliver it. So just in closing then, just a few remarks. I am really pleased by the energy and drive and commitment that I have detected within government, across the civil service, across ministers, to really move this forward. Second, I want to reiterate that the fundamentals have got to be in place. That's to say, the jury system, an independent judiciary, barristers and advocates who prosecute and defend. That's very important. And recognizing also that as we look to a future in a different relationship with the rest of the world, when we talk about global Britain, let's remember that this is a nation of laws, one nation of laws, and that means that there has got to be equality before the law and access to justice as well. And that's really important because it underpins our reputation, and it's the kind of country that I think we want to be as we step out into the world as well. A nation of laws, one nation of laws. That's important. So the recent focus on race in the media has shone a sometimes painful spotlight on the realities, but it has had, I think, a galvanizing effect. And Nina was mentioning just at the beginning about, or it was mentioned that she's from Cheltenham. She will know that my constituency is about 99% white, I think, 98% white, very, very white community. And yet, following the death of George Floyd, something extraordinary happened. So in Pittville Park, which Nina will remember, one of the most beautiful parts of Cheltenham, a full 5,000 people turned out. Bear in mind, Cheltenham is a town of about 100,000. 5,000 people turned out to pay their respects and to commit themselves to a fairer and more just racial future. And I thought that was extraordinary. And it feels like an inflection point. It feels like an inflection point. And within government, we're determined for this to be the moment where we galvanize further our efforts in this regard, using the power of data to shine a spotlight. We need to challenge our assumptions. We need to think boldly. We need to redouble our efforts. And ultimately, to quote Regulation Recommendation 4, explain or change. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alex. That's really helpful introduction, and you will be able to see when you have a moment to look at the Q&A that you've stimulated a number of questions from our members. Colleagues, I'm going to take these in the straight order in which they come, and we will try to get through as many as we possibly can in the next 20 minutes or so. So with no further hesitation, I'm going to go first to Transform Justice, which I suspect is our good colleague Penelope Gibbs, and after her I'm putting Whitney Isles on notice that you'll be the next person. So Jamie, if you could demute, if that's a word, Penelope, and then we will take her question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah.
Great, fantastic. Hi, Minister.
Hello.
A question about remand. So a disproportionate number of those from BME communities are remanded by the courts, and most of those who are remanded and tried in magistrates' courts do not go on to receive a custodial sentence. Are you concerned about this disproportionality, particularly given the outcomes?
Well, I think that's an extremely important point, and I think it's something that certainly merits close scrutiny. We do, of course, have an independent judiciary. They have to consider the facts in front of them. We've also got to understand, of course, is that if people are remanded in custody, it doesn't necessarily mean it's because people fear they're going to commit further offences, or indeed they'll get a custodial sentence. It could be, for example, that there are concerns about whether they would fail to surrender or interfere with witnesses, or even for their own protection. So I think it is definitely something that is worth looking at. It is quite difficult to get under the skin of it because each case is obviously fact specific. But the point is a fair one. We should constantly redouble our efforts to shine a light on these issues. But I would just leave you with this one point. The question about whether, for example, a court may be justified in respect of an offence where the person may not ultimately get a custodial sentence to remand them in custody, say for the sake of argument, there's a concern about them failing to surrender. Well, why might that person have been at risk of failing to surrender? What was it in their particular circumstances? Is it something because of other aspects of their life, their housing situation, for example? These are the sorts of things which may only be tangentially related to the issue of the criminality, which may on the one hand have justified the judge in withholding bail, but actually might reflect a wider problem within our society. And one of the exciting things about the ethnicity facts and figures thing that I mentioned to you before is you can look at the extent to which people's housing, for example, is related to ethnicity. So of course, let's look at it, but let's not assume that all the judges are getting it wrong. It may be that the problem lies upstream in our society.
Thank you.
Brilliant. And thank you, Penelope. Our second question is from Whitney Isles, and it is in relation to transparency of data. And after that, I'm going to go to Why Me? So, Whitney.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. So last week we saw data being released from America in relation to COVID-19 deaths, and how in some states we were seeing over 75% of those in prison who have died from COVID-19 being people of color. And I am just wondering if and when the MOJ and HMPPS will be kind of releasing the same kind of data over here in relation to ethnicity.
Right.
I'm interested to see how we can actually use transparency of data kind of as and when things are happening, especially with what we're seeing in relation of treatment of prisoners through record of our own, and how we can actually get on top of things as things are happening rather than kind of in hindsight and having to do an inquiry later on down the line.
Okay, that is a great point, if I may say so. So let me just 2 points I want to make. First of all, I can't speak for the situation in custody in the United States, but the position in England and Wales is, and of course we cross our fingers and we hold our breath and we make sure it's going to be, we're not going to have a big problem. But by and large, not least, by the way, thanks to prisoners who seem to have responded well, we've avoided the kind of catastrophic ripping through our prisons that we feared with this virus. And that does mean that a lot of prisoners have had to make enormous adjustments, and there's been much less by way of association, and a lot of people locked up for a large number of hours in a day in a regime a lot of us would feel very uncomfortable about. So I want to just make that point. But the second issue is about access to real-time data. And that's really essential, because for the point that you indicate, we want to be able to respond quickly and immediately rather than necessarily having all the damage inflicted and then us having to look after the event. So in terms of data on testing, which is a slightly different point, we are now in a much, much better place to see in very short order, and it's published on the gov.uk website where, for example, there's testing going on or the number of positive tests that are found in places like Gloucestershire. So I can go online now and I can see whether in my constituency, what's happened in the last recent hours. So I can see for myself whether there are spikes and so on. Now, in terms of whether there is to be data published about in which prison, for example, and what the ethnicity is of those people who have been diagnosed, well, there are, of course, competing considerations. You need to make sure that prisoners aren't identified because they've got a right to privacy as well. But it is important that the MOJ has the ability to respond very fast, and HMPPS to keep prisoners safe. And they are doing so. And what I do also know is that they're committed to being as transparent as possible within that framework of ensuring that you're not going to undermine the very public health imperatives that you want to see succeed, but to the maximum possible transparency of data. And as I said before, the thing which is the most positive thing in this whole space, I think, is the extent to which we have transformed the transparency of data. And I would invite you to go and look at the ethnicity facts and figures. I, for one, would be in favor of the most timely and transparent data that we can reasonably create, and that's the direction of travel, it seems to me.
Thank you, Alex. All right, so we're now going to go to a question from Why Me, which I suspect is from Lucy Jaff, the director of Why Me. Lucy, I've noticed that you've asked two questions. The first one looks a pretty straightforward machinery of government question, so I'm going to allow you to ask both as long as you can do so fairly succinctly. Clearly, it's really important to hear the question about victims as well as other questions. So, Lucy, the floor is yours.
Oh, hello. Good morning. Good morning, Alex. It's Lucy Jaffe from.
Hi, Lucy.
Hi, we have met in the past.
We have.
Restorative justice. And is the relationship between the Race Disparity Unit and the Race and Ethnicity Justice Board, and who is the minister responsible for both of these bodies?
Okay. Yeah.
And secondly, could you just address the disproportionate impact of crime on Black and minority ethnic victims and witnesses? And I mean, Lamy to touches on it, but the main focus is on the people who perpetrate crime, and then the fit for purpose services to support those people. So that's the impact of crime on Black and minority ethnic victims and witnesses, and whether we have services which are fit to support them.
Right. Okay. Listen, I think that's a really, really important point. I'm going to deal with the second one first, if I may. And you're right. This report, the Lamy review, is overwhelmingly. I mean, it's, in fact, the strapline at the top says an independent review into the treatment of and outcomes for Black, Asian, and minority ethnic individuals in the criminal justice system, and it's looking through the lens of the experience of defendants, suspects, and defendants. But you raise a really, really important point because. Again, forgive me for stating the obvious, something that everyone on this call will know, but that you're more likely to be a victim of crime and disproportionately so. Now, the question is how you go about ensuring that it is a more, that people can access justice, if you like. In other words, if you've been the victim of crime, that you can get the justice you deserve. The key things, I think, in that respect are, and this is something that I also have responsibility for, is to ensure that the process is one that is sensitive, robust, and accessible. And particularly, we're looking at if you look at, for example, the Victims Code, that's critically important. The most significant change, I think, that there has been over recent years is the fact that if you are the victim of crime, instead of being shut out of the process, you just have to turn up, make your statement, no prosecutor comes and talks to you, no police officer tells you afterwards what happened, no opportunity for you to say anything at sentencing. Now, of course, you can make your what used to be called a victim impact statement, a victim personal statement. You can say, listen, I am from this community, say, and I want you to understand, Judge, don't put it quite in these terms, I want you to understand the impact that this has had upon me, but also the community that I'm in, how I felt, my experience as, for example, a black person or somebody who's from a different community, how this particular incident of, say for the sake of argument, racial abuse or threatening behavior or GBH or whatever it was, how it had that impact. So that's a critically important thing. The second is it's so important now that prosecutors reach out pre-trial to individuals to say, how might your evidence be best received in court? Do you need, for example, a screen? Because when you go into court, because there may be cultural issues or whatever it is, for you to be seeing the defendant, for them to be eyeballing you, boring a hole in the side of your head as you're giving evidence, that may be particularly difficult. There's much more sensitivity in that regard, but we need to go further, which is why we want to bring in a victims law. And that's to allow people to have those rights which are already set out in the code, which we'll be updating incidentally, to ensure that they're given statutory effect. So I think it's about having a more sympathetic, understanding, sensitive, but also robust system that ensures that victims and witnesses aren't just like a kind of evidential part of the machinery of a trial, but they are, as it were, valued, and although the prosecutor has to have that necessary detachment, that he or she recognizes their value and will be courteous. So last thing I'll say on this is at the end of a trial, sorry, at the end of a day's evidence, I would always want to go and speak to the witnesses, or perhaps the mother of the victim, say, to explain what had happened in court that day. So I think that's a really important human aspect to it. On the machinery of government point, I'm going to ask my officials just to confirm the position on that, but I think it's all in the Cabinet Office, but I'm going to ask my officials just to clarify that point, please.
Alex, thank you for that. And I can already see that we're unlikely to get to...
Sorry, I'll be shorter answers. I'll give shorter answers.
I wouldn't ask you to speed up. I was just going to say there will be some questions we won't get to. So if we could sort of tack them on to any clarification that you've added as well, then we can include them in our note that we send round. But I'm now going to go to James Nichols from Transform, which is the Drugs Policy Forum. James.
Yeah. Are you on mute, James? I can't hear you.
No, I can't hear it.
I'm being muted.
Oh, there you go. There you go.
Sorry, there you go. Sorry about that. Thank you for taking the question. So what are your thoughts on racial disparities in drug policing specifically? So we know that Black and Asian people are far more likely to be searched, charged and imprisoned for drug offences than white people, despite prevalence of use being higher in white communities. So what's your thoughts on the impact of that on community relations? And what might we be able to do about that?
Right. Okay. It's a great point. And by the way, you poor thing, you fell victim to what is going to become the phrase of 2020, which is "you're on mute." That's the one we will all that will go into the dictionary of quotations. Well, look, I think you identify a really, really important point, because what you are able to identify is, notwithstanding where the prevalence of drug use and drug supply might be by way of ethnicity, that's not necessarily reflected in stop and search or indeed in convictions and so on. And that goes back to my point about bias and the perception of bias. And the short answer to your question is, this is precisely the sort of issue which we have to, going back to recommendation 5, we have to either explain or change. And that is, I think that is exactly the sort of thing that the racial disparity unit was set up to look at, and indeed these ethnicity facts and figures. And I sense that there is a renewed energy and determination which exists, I'm pleased to say, not just sitting there within the centre of government in the MOJ, not just sitting there in the court system or whatever, but I also think within the police as well, to look again at this. I do sense a kind of, as I say, this real inflection point. And I think our ability to drill down on that is going to be supported by better data than we've ever had before. In other words, can we establish beyond peradventure, as lawyers pompously say, beyond peradventure, that what might be the perception namely precisely this, that putting it in very bald terms, that white people are doing just as much drugs as anyone else, but they're not getting charged and convicted at the same rate, whether that is borne out by the data. And if that is the case, I sense a renewed effort to drill down on it, because if those concerns perpetuate, that undermines confidence in the criminal justice system.
Thank you, Alex. Our next question is from Kimit Edgar from the Prison Reform Trust. Kimit.
Thank you, Minister. Gerard, a 16-year-old, was assaulted on a Black Lives Matter event a month ago. So he went to a police officer who promptly subjected him to stop and search. His experience is a really clear illustration of a problem that goes right through the criminal justice system. I'm a prisons researcher, and it's certainly through the prison system. And that is that the problem of distrust is mutual. So what will government do to manage the performance of its criminal justice practitioners so that they learn to extend trust equally? Thanks.
Well, look, I don't know what happened in that specific case, but you identify a really important point, and that's this issue of trust. And there is no doubt that the whole experience of the George Floyd incident indicated or demonstrated that there is that issue. And I think that we've got to be frank and sensible and recognize that it exists. So you ask, what is the solution on all this? Well, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I think that the data is important, because one of the things, for example, that we are requiring far more effectively, I think, and I just step out by way of analogy, one of the things that we've been involved in doing is giving a lot of money through COVID to community organizations that are delivering support for victims of domestic abuse, right? Okay, so that's what we do. Now, in the past, what we might have done is give all that money to the Police and Crime Commission and say, over to you, go and sort it out, please, and just try and provide these services. Now, we require much more effective audits on, for example, the extent to which that has reached out and delivered in a proportionate way to people who are victims of BAME community. So that's just one within the BAME community. So that's one example of where we can use data to deal with it more effectively. But I think ultimately that the position is this: we need to show that where people can demonstrate that they have been the victims of an approach which is unfair, that there is a remedy to that, and that it is not something which is simply one of the vicissitudes of life. It's just one of those things. But people need to be satisfied that if they can establish that they have been targeted in that way, that there is some comeback. And we all have a responsibility in that regard. So, for example, there will be those who, for example, can need to be empowered to take action against the police and the courts if that's what they want to do. But there need to be others who can challenge government as well, to say, look at this data. Look at the proportion of stop and searches when people have, in the situation that Gerard described. What are you going to do about it? Can you explain it? If you can't explain it, how are you going to change? So everyone has their part to play, but I sense a real enthusiasm, but a targeted enthusiasm. In other words, not just going out and saying, right, can we all just be a bit fairer? No, a far more assertive, evidence-based, clear and cogent approach in this regard, building on that new tool which we have at our disposal, which is the more transparent publication of data than I think we've ever seen. So that's what gives me real pause for thought and gives me real optimism for the future.
Thanks, Alex. Colleagues, I think we may only have time for one remaining question, and I'll come back to how we'll deal with the outstanding questions if that is the case. So I'm now going to go to Jess Mullen from Clinks, and Jess has kindly promised to merge her questions into one in light of the time. Jess.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Loud and clear.
Wonderful. Yeah, other people have touched on a couple of my other questions, so I'll keep this brief. Minister, thank you very much. Clinks is the infrastructure charity for the voluntary sector working in criminal justice. And we're very conscious that the the prison system has been facing unprecedented challenges in the face of COVID-19, and that also BAME communities have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic.
Yeah.
And obviously it's important to consider those things alongside the overrepresentation of and disparity of outcomes that we've been talking about this morning. And there's a real feeling from our members that the BAME-led voluntary sector, who really understand the impact that COVID-19 has had on their communities and are able to respond to the needs of those communities, is absolutely vital to the criminal justice system in its recovery from COVID-19. So I just wanted to ask what plans the department had for further engaging that part of the voluntary sector in the recovery process from COVID-19 and beyond.
Well, that's a great question. Can you just back up a sec? Can you just repeat the particular area that you think should be engaged more, because that just broke out, just cut it off.
Well, I'm talking really about the recovery from COVID-19 and the role that BAME-led voluntary sector organisations need to play in supporting people in the criminal justice system in that. We would, argue that the BAME-led voluntary sector really contributes a huge amount to working alongside the prison system and the probation system, but that isn't always taken advantage of in the way the system best could. So I suppose what I'm asking is, how might the system better engage those organisations going forward?
Yeah, okay, well look, that's a really, really important point, because we've got to take everyone with us in that regard. Now, there is quite a lot of engagement that happens already, but the question is always, are we in the MOJ speaking to the right people? And that's constantly the question we have to ask ourselves. So for example, recently the Prime Minister organised something called a Hidden Harms Summit, which is a slightly separate context, but it's a useful example, where we did this thing from number 10 and we spoke to a whole load of organisations, including, for example, the Victims Commissioner, the Domestic Abuse Commissioner, and this was in the context of domestic abuse. And you've got a whole load of stakeholders, including some who might be for, the Southall Black Sisters or IMCAN, a lot of these organisations who do already have established lines of communication in with the MOJ. Now, the question, of course, that we always have to keep challenging ourselves is, when we look at all these faces on the Zoom calls, is, are we speaking to the right people? And I am extremely conscious, particularly at a time of COVID, that there's a danger that you simply stick with you continue to plough the furrow you're in, and you stick with the accepted lines of communication. So on the one hand, I think I can reassure you that there are very good lines of communication that already exist. One other example is we set up silver command of a lot of stakeholders when looking at the DA space, domestic abuse space, to ensure that we were speaking to the right people. And that, by the way, was at pains to ensure that there were people from a diversity of communities. So that's point one. But point two is, we do constantly need to challenge ourselves. Are we just speaking to the same familiar voices? So I make a point of ensuring that I am reaching out. But look, my door is open. If you say to me, Minister, we really think, because things move fast and trends evolve and so on, that there are new groups and new organizations, particularly at a time of COVID, which you need to be aware of, then let me know. My door is open. Let my officials know, and we will look at that, because I want to make sure we have the best input, the best advice, the best feedback, and one which can command confidence. Because if we are to be a great society that moves forward, that challenges these things, we've all got a part to play, but we have to have confidence in one another. And that means that from this side of the fence, sitting in government, we have to have open hearts, open hands, if you see what I mean, and be receptive to that sort of thing. So my door is open.
Thank you, Alex. That's great. Alex, I think we've probably come to the end of your slot. Thank you firstly for extending that and giving a greater opportunity for our members to ask you questions. You'll have seen we haven't got to the end. Not bad, but we haven't got to the end of the questions. Can we send them on to your office?
You can.
Brilliant. That's
please do. And can I just end by thanking you very much for organising this and for the very valuable challenges that I've received, which I really do appreciate. And once again, my thanks to you for the work that you do and for the contributions that have been made on this call.
Thank you. That's great. And just to say one closing comment from me, apropos of your answer to Jess just now from Clinks, we will certainly also, as a Criminal Justice Alliance, make sure that our members are aware of your invitation there about your door being open, and Nina will coordinate that from our point of view as well. So that's a really good offer. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks. Bye-bye. Okay, colleagues. So that completes the first part of today's meeting. And we're now, in our customary fashion, going to move on to a panel discussion on the topic of how can we tackle race disparity across the criminal justice system. And we've assembled a really good and diverse panel to talk about this issue. I'm going to introduce the speakers not quite one by one, but in turn, and they will speak for a short time separately, and then we will have a panel discussion after that. When I say I'm going to introduce them not quite one by one, that reflects the fact that I'm going to introduce our first two speakers together. So our first speaker is Jake Ferguson, who many of you will know has been the outstanding leader of Hackney CVS for, well, it says on my prompt, 19 years. I can't believe how those 19 years have passed. But as many of you will know, Hackney CVS is an outstanding organisation and has made an incredibly positive contribution to a whole range of issues, including those that we're discussing today. Jake recently established Black Men for Change in the summer of 2019 as an important space for African and Caribbean heritage men to talk about the issues they face and to develop strategic approaches to these. And he's been working, as you would imagine, closely with Hackney Council and partners on the prospect of making Hackney an anti-racist borough. And Jake is joined by Emmanuel Onapa, who is a speaker and youth leader at Hackney CVS and will be providing his unique perspective in support of Jake and the work that Hackney CVS are doing. So Jake and Emmanuel, you're both really welcome. I'm not quite sure how you're going to divide up your slot between you, but I'm handing it over to you.
Thanks very much, John, and thanks, Nina, for the invite. It's always great to talk to really important networks like the CJA. I'm not going to talk for too long because, whenever we have these opportunities to talk about our work, I think to have those that are actually intrinsically involved as young people is so important. Their voices are absolutely key. So I'd like to give as much space as possible for Emmanuel, but let me just maybe kick off with a bit of background so that people can understand perhaps some of the things that I'm going to say to you all. It was interesting having the minister on this call. He kept talking about the perceptions of racial injustice, and to be honest, I think we need to move way beyond perceptions. The data has been around for years, so I think let's not avoid the usual trap of hiding behind data when actions really need to be brought forward in the light of where we are in terms of justice in this country. So as a CVS, a bit like Clinks, we provide support to local community groups and we create partnerships, but we also do other things as well, because as a values-driven organisation like you guys, we want a fairer society. We want equity for everyone. And I think that means that we have to stand up and be counted and to be really, really clear about what we stand for as charities, because we're often in a unique position of being able to talk to ministers or speak to power. So it's really important that we have a common sense of where we want to get to. And I think around race justice, I've been blessed by being surrounded by people like Jeremy, Lee Jasper, Leroy Logan, who are all members of a network which I created last summer called Black Men for Change. And it was all about us feeling as professionals who are Black that we don't work enough together. We don't have that space to really talk about how we see things and where we think things are going wrong. And one of the key drivers for us as a network is this keenness to change the narrative around particularly serious violence. In this country, you know, we still have this belief that, you know, it's all about the individual and how the individual needs to change in order to get fairer justice. And actually, we've got a system in this country that the data that Alex talked to quite clearly shows that if you're of African or Caribbean descent, you actually face state violence. So what I mean by that is the police are more likely to treat you disrespectfully and in some cases brutalize you, and in some cases children as young as 12, 13, 14 being handcuffed, put in the back of vans and whatnot. And also if you look at mental health services in the way that some African heritage people are more likely to be sentenced. What's that about? Well, for me, at the heart of this, we have a society, and the George Floyd incident is an example of that, but we have a society that doesn't value Black people as much as others. And that plays out in how then the criminal justice system works in this country. And I think we have to move to a sense of joint ownership of what those values should be. And I've been recently pushing the Mayor of London and my local mayor in Hackney that we need to be collectively working on a strategy that will make Hackney and London an anti-racist place, that we no longer tolerate racism. And interestingly, I'm quite keen that I spoke to the Deputy Mayor, Sophie Linden, last week and said, look, you need to be jointly standing up with Cressida Dick, the police commissioner, and saying, we no longer tolerate structural racism. And until they make bold statements like that, I feel we're going to be often hiding behind data and perceptions of things maybe being wrong. We need to be bold as a society and say, look, racism doesn't do anybody any favours. In fact, it criminalises certain members of our community, it traumatises others and so on. And as we've heard earlier, that victims also are disproportionately affected if they're of African or Caribbean origin. So whenever I have the opportunity to talk at these events or to speak truth to power, I try and keep things simple and real. This is about us all being equals. So if we're not all equally being treated fairly, then we need to reverse the structures of power so that then people who are being disproportionately affected have the power and agency to either hold government to account or to help themselves and their communities. I've been involved in a number of conversations amongst various people from the Black community recently who've got to the stage of thinking that we may well need to police ourselves because we can't trust the police to be a police service as opposed to a police force. And that's a sad indictment on our society. So I think there's a lot we need to do. I'm also interested in the economics of violence and structural oppression. You know, it pains me when I see the amount of money we will spend putting a young person in a young offenders institution, which, I mean, I think by the latest estimates costs something like £120,000 a year. I mean, come on. Is that what we want as taxpayers? To actually fund the incarceration of young people, when if you gave me 120,000, I'd employ that young person, I'd set them up in a nice flat in a swanky place, probably with that sort of money, you could pay good rent, and I'd help them. You know what I mean? Yet we prefer to put them in an institution. So that for me is criminally wrong. So the things that we're talking about at the minute, for those that don't know, I'm a member of the London Mayor's Violence Reduction Unit Partnership Board, which brings all the key players together. I've been sort of pushing for, we are pushing as a Black Men for Change network, a totally new approach to policing, to community policing, something that we can, as a community, work with the mayor, work with the Met to create something which builds confidence. Confidence of African Caribbean people in the police is at an all-time low. In some cases like Lambeth, it's like 25-30% confidence in police, and that is an indictment on our society. We need to get this right. We need to do something radically different, because can we trust the police to treat us fairly? I think history tells us not. So either we're going to have to sort of say to the Met, if you're not going to change and you're not going to show that you no longer racially profile, we're going to take money from you. Or if you're not able to prevent yourselves from not using your own guidelines to arrest people safely. I mean, we had an incident a few weeks ago in Hackney where 2 robbery officers took a young man off his bike, black young man, cuffed him face down and had their knees on his neck. Have we not learnt from George Floyd? And at the heart of that is police officers just see black people as pieces of meat. And I don't want to cause offence by that. I actually mean what I'm saying. They have no value towards us. So a lot of people are scared to let their kids out because they're not necessarily scared about them interacting with the young people. They're scared that the police will do them damage. So really, is that the society we want? So I'm going to stop there because I'm probably in danger of waffling and preaching. But as you can see, I'm very passionate about this, and I'm really passionate about the fact that in Hackney, we have some fantastic young people like Emmanuel who are prepared to do their research. Emmanuel will talk about the work of our account group, which is effectively our youth independent advisory group, which holds the Met to account. They've been brilliant. They've put their recommendations to the Met. What was shocking was that the Met, our local officers, didn't even know what best use of stop and search was, which is a standard national policy that the police can use. So our own borough commander was shamed by our young people who'd done their research and put recommendations to them, and they didn't even understand their own policies. But this is the size of the problem we're dealing with. So I'll shut up now, and can I hand over to Emmanuel, who can talk far more eloquently about what this means to him as a young person and to his colleagues on the account group. Over to you, Emmanuel.
Hello, my name is Emmanuel Onapa. I'm a researcher at Hackney Account, and I'm a youth leader for Hackney CVS. I'm also the campaigns manager for Hackney Account. We've been doing research for, I'll say, over a year now, where we had to interview a lot of young black men in Hackney that have faced the criminal justice system at a young age. So we conducted a lot of interviews, including using secondary research in order to come up with our conclusions and findings. And what we found from our research is that a lot of young black men face trauma from being stopped and searched. And in areas in Hackney especially, when a stop and search is implemented, black men are 9 times more likely to be stopped and searched than their white counterparts. And that has a dramatic effect, which is extremely negative on young black men, because normally at a young age, this is their first encounter with government institutions, which is not really a positive one. Then it leads to them kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, because they're criminalized at a young age, and that has a long-lasting effect onto them. A lot of our researchers are from our community, so we have about 5 researchers, and even them, when they were doing the research, they had to deal with a sense of trauma where while they're conducting the research, it's kind of hard for them. And these are just members of society where these people are fragmented and kind of left behind. A poll by YouGov in 2017, the findings of that poll showed that over 500,000 young black men felt that they're no longer British anymore because of their encounters with police or what their peers understand or what they've gone through. And issues like this need to be addressed. the government, Boris Johnson, said he implemented 16 of the recommendations of the Lammy Review. That was called out recently as he was misleading the public. And it's not until recommendations such as recommendation 16, which is the government should set out a clear national target to achieve a representative judiciary and magistracy by 2025. These recommendations bring the community grassroots organizations such as Hackney CVS and Account into the picture. And it's only through unity, through the community being brought to the forefront, we are able to achieve justice and equality. And what we're fighting for is simply human rights, simple human rights that should have been granted to us from early. And yeah, that's all I've got really say, to be honest. And
thank you, Emmanuel, and thank you, Jake, as well. And if I could just echo the comment that Mike Pattinson made in the Q&A box. There was no waffle in either of your contributions. Clear, calm messaging and things that just must change. So thank you both very much indeed. There'll be an opportunity to pick up on the points that you've made and others later on when we've heard from our other speakers. Our next speaker is Pastor Lorraine Jones, who set up the Dwayne Simpson Foundation after losing her son tragically in 2014. And Dwayne and Lorraine has been, her contribution has been acknowledged in a number of different ways, including receiving an MBE in the Queen's Awards in 2017. And she's also received the Point of Light Award from David Cameron when he was Prime Minister. But the tribute to her that I like the most is where she has been called the Chief Angel of Angel Town. So Lorraine, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm very grateful that I can have this space to interact with you all. Yeah, just highlighting that the foundation was established in 2015 following the murder of my son, and Dwaynamics is affiliated boxing project which my late son started before he was killed. So we've continued with that, and that is the pioneering project which received the MBE, Dwaynamics ABC. What we do is engage with young people and families. We also network with agencies which have an impact on the general health, well-being and development of our members. So we're not just a boxing club, but we're a community hub. And we have a number of young people that have not been involved with the criminal justice system, but have had brothers or sisters that have had an impact with that, which has also impacted on them mentally, emotionally, and their well-being. So within our project, which is boxing and fitness, we've found that it helps tremendously with the physical side as well as the mental and emotional side of developing our young people. Through the hub, a lot of engagement and conversations come out where we're able to address those with the police, with the council, with the NHS, generally just being that point of contact for the families to help other areas. Recently, we had a number of letters that were written to us from individuals in prison, highlighting their challenges, their aspirations for what they want to do when they come out. And I know we did have a question for the minister, which was talking about the number of those that have been affected by COVID-19 and also the care in there. And that's something which is very, very important for us to address. When I got that letter 2 weeks ago, it was from a young man that was coming to the end of his sentence for murder. And his aspirations was that he really wants to come out and reintegrate in the community and work and help around the issues with youth violence to stop young people making bad decisions to go into, which will result in them being, put in prison. I'm highlighting that because there is a great need, there is a great aspiration, there's a great interest from so many, which even that are in the prison, that want to help us to turn this tide around for our society to be very, very reduced with crime and more prosperous, with everyone living a more healthier life. So that's just a tiny bit about what we do. I'm very, very keen for questions to be asked so that I can, share, because we cover a broad platform in interacting with the community, with young people, with schools, with the police, the council, and just to share what we've learned from all aspects.
Thank you, Lorraine. That's really helpful introduction, and also a really helpful prompt to how we're going to run the discussion part once we've heard from all the panel members. Colleague, can I say, if you would like either to make a contribution or ask a question, can you continue to use the Q&A box? But if you just want to make a contribution, or I shouldn't say just, if you want to make a contribution, you need only put your name in there, and I'll take that as a figurative raising of your hand. So if people who know that they would like to contribute to this discussion once we've heard from our final two speakers, if they would like to just put their name in the Q&A box, by all means ask a question as well if you want, but I will simply take, as I did with the questions, the names in the order in which they come to me. So absolutely just follow that as you will. Right, so if I can turn, though, we've still got two remaining speakers for today. So if I can turn to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Shaista Gohir, who is the co-chair from the Muslim Women's Network, and who has in particular produced a report, Unheard Voices, on the very underreported issue of sexual exploitation of women from Black and minority ethnic communities, but has been very active in this whole field for several years now. Shaista, the floor is yours.
Unmute myself. Thank you very much for inviting me to contribute. So at the Women's Network, we've got, we run a national helpline, and we help over 1,200 women on that, and we carry out research, and we've got membership. So we very much try to find out about the experiences of Muslim women and girls, and obviously then try and use that for advocacy. So when we find that people aren't talking about their experiences, we want to try and then highlight that. So hence the research that you alluded to, which is the sexual exploitation of Asian girls. No one was talking about that. No one was talking about that. Actually, the gangs, the grooming gangs, were also targeting them. So we highlighted that. But last year, what we did was we launched a report, which was Muslim Women's Experience of the Criminal Justice System. And if anyone wants to, it's here. Anyone wants to download that, you can download that from our website, Muslim Women's Network resources section. Because what we were finding was that when women were contacting us on the helpline, about 20%, so over 200, there was police involvement. And with some of that, there was the involvement of the Crown Prosecution Service as well. So we wanted to find out about their experiences, because constantly they were saying, can you ring up the police? Can you ring up the CPS? I think a few things were happening. Their experiences were not being well understood. There were barriers, they were not being listened to. They were being fobbed off, or they were not being kept up to date. So what we found was that women were dropping out of the criminal justice system. So if that's happening, women are not going to report again. It's going to embolden perpetrators and they're not going to get the justice. So I think it'd be interesting if someone could do research, and the minister's not here, but if there's any data on where Black and ethnic minority women are dropping out of the criminal justice system. So when they're victims and when they report, where do they drop out? Is it at the police level? Is it the Crown prosecution level? So I think that was one of the key things that we were trying to highlight. We were going to do some training actually with magistrates and judges and barristers, because what we did find was there was bias. So we just highlighted with one particular case where this woman who, well, she'd been forced at marriage at 16. By the time she was 21, she was a victim of sexual abuse and rape for 5 years. And then she then became the perpetrator. She actually defended herself and stabbed her husband in the leg. But she was arrested. And when it came to sentencing, she was given a custodial sentence, despite suffering abuse, despite, you know, having a young child under the age of 5. And the husband has not given her British citizenship through marriage because he wanted to use that as a form of control. But she was given a custodial sentence, which meant that she would be sent back, suffer honour-based violence and never see her child again. But then when you compare that to that well-known case 3 years ago, a young white lady, Oxford student, she'd stabbed her partner in the leg. It wasn't in self-defence. And she was given a suspended sentence because the judge was worried about her future. So who was worried about the future of this, you know, young girl who had a child? So I think it's really, really important. I think if there's data on this, that we really need to highlight it. So I think now fast forwarding, so I don't want to go into all the cases in the report because you can read that. I mean, what's happening now? So I think during COVID, we already had seen sort of bias amongst police and also the judiciary. I think that's just going to get worse during COVID. So, for example, I know that in now that there's flexibility. Now, I think cases can be presented to the judge from 8 a.m. to 7 p.m. And we know that we had highlighted poor legal representation because, for example, criminal law barristers are overworked and underpaid. So you can just imagine those hours now, they've got to prepare for cases. It's just going to maybe try to get victims to plead guilty, which is what happened in the case that I just highlighted earlier, which means that their cases aren't going to be properly heard. So I'm quite worried about that, and I think that needs to be looked at as well. Then when it comes to sort of policing as well, we've highlighted bias in that, and I was really disappointed that when, for example, when they are giving advice, referring them to specialist organisations, you know, the domestic abuse bill, that bit about specialist organisations was voted against. And it's a shame because that would kind of maybe force police to ensure that victims are given a wide range choice of organisations, because I would like the police to refer people to us. And it's very easy for the police to go to the main organisation in the area, which is usually one of the Women's Aid. They do fantastic work, but they're not always the best person to serve, you know, victims of diverse backgrounds. And I think it's really important for police to know who's on their patch and give women informed choices about, here's a range of organisations that you can contact. And I feel that with that bit not being passed in the bill, I think the police will just carry on. So maybe some training with the police around that diversity in terms of, you know, for example, Muslim Women's Network exists in the West Midlands, or, you know, nationally, the national organisation. So I think the very final point I want to make is around domestic abuse. Everyone keeps talking about this figure of 25%. Domestic abuse has gone up by 25%, or reporting has gone up. Now, that's not the case in Black and ethnic minority organisations. That doesn't mean that abuse isn't there, it's there, but it's harder for them to report. So for us, we analysed our statistics and they'd gone up by 5%. So we're finding that women are finding it harder to report because they live in extended families. So I think it's really important not just to think, oh, well, it's 25% across the board. What can we do to reach out women who find it harder to report? So could we, is there a way of maybe reaching out to them? But that's forced us to think creatively. So, you know, they can't speak on the phone, their emails are being monitored, internet activities are being monitored, text messages are being checked. That's forced Muslim Women's Network now to think more creatively. So now we've just won some funding from Comic Relief, and we're going to develop a domestic abuse app, which then allows Muslim women to contact organisations, including ours, you know, more covertly, because you can, you know, hide the app and there'll be a pin lock on it and things like that. So that's kind of forced us to think creatively, but that's not going to be launched until next year. I'm going to end there because I know I was only given 5 minutes and I could really go on and on about what we're finding on the helpline. So I'll kind of stop there really, and hopefully when the app is launched, you know, we'll come back and tell you more about it.
I'm sorry about the only 5 minutes, but you managed to pack a huge amount in there. And you know, listening to all of the speakers so far, it does occur to me that one of the things that we could usefully do with your agreement is capture some key points that you've been making and make sure they're passed back to the Minister's office, because it's a great pity that he hasn't been able to hear your contributions. I particularly liked your focus on underreported issues, and also the issue about why do people drop out of the system. That seems to me to be absolutely central to what the Minister previously was speaking about confidence in the judicial and the criminal justice systems. So thank you really very much for that. Colleagues, I've already got one person queued up to come into the discussion part of the session, but we've one final speaker before we get there. But do add your names if you know that you're going to want to come in, and I will make sure that I bring you in. Our final speaker though, from the panel is Jeremy Crook, who will be known to many of you, and who is the Chief Executive of the Black Training and Enterprise Group. I probably don't need to talk too much about BTEC as an organisation. Has done incredibly important work in the area of racial disparity and really pushing for a greater acknowledgement of the issue at times in climates where it must have felt, Jeremy, that you were one of the very few voices making these points. Jeremy has recently completed a 2-year part-time secondment to the Prison and Probation Service, supporting the LAMI review implementation. I don't know, Jeremy, whether you're going to talk about the difficulties with implementation now or perhaps under discussion. But anyway, the floor is yours.
Thank you, John, and Nina, and CJA, and everyone. Really good to hear from Jake and Emmanuel, Lorraine, and Shaista. Very, very powerful speeches. I think it seems to me, as we all probably thinking, it's a big turning point, isn't it, for our country, with George Floyd, Black Lives Matter. We've left the EU basically. We're in a major recession. Youth unemployment is probably going to hit 1 million or whatever more. And you just think, in terms of racism, is this the point in our journey as a society that we really do reduce it, try and eradicate it, particularly in the justice system? And it was good to hear from the Minister, and I've spoken to him. This is the second time I've listened to him and to what he's got to say, and it's very important. But we know that the judiciary is not representative of the country in terms of ethnicity. And that's a real challenge that we'd like the government and the MOJ to really focus down on with the judiciary, because it needs to improve. And that's a fundamental part of our justice system. I was looking at a report yesterday from the Equality and Human Rights Commission, Research Report 50. And it was very kind of disheartening to read back in 2010 that young Black people were 3.5 times more likely to be arrested than white young people. In the 2020 update from the MOJ, Black children are over 4 times more likely to be arrested than white children now. So in 10 years, we've seen virtually no change whatsoever. And I think whilst I welcome the Minister's focus on data, which is very important, and I'm still a member of the Cabinet Office Race Disparity Unit Advisory Group, which is chaired by Lord Woolley, we probably need another database which looks at the action that's been taken to reduce those disparities, because we can't just keep looking at data without change. And I think it's a duty for everyone to just kind of look at our organizations, representation, the experience of Black and Asian people and GRT individuals, and see what we are doing to make that experience better. I think in terms of prison probation service, having spent time both in BTEC, delivering services for young people in youth offending institutions and PRUs in schools, and then going to talk to staff and prisoners in prisons, both youth and adult, you just don't feel yet that for their everyday lived experience, their quality of life and their treatment is fair and inclusive and responsive. And that includes for Muslim communities as well. So we've got to really push hard to get beyond the data and make sure that LAMI is delivered properly, and we go beyond LAMI, of course, and make the whole system a better system for all. And the other speakers have outlined some of the key issues there. I think in terms of the prison system and probation, if things aren't measured, they aren't really taken seriously. If there's no accountability, they aren't taken seriously by leaders. And I think having a performance tool in the prison system and probation would be a good thing, particularly the prison system. And we'll have to wait, I think, till 2022 to see that performance tool operational, so that prisons and ministers and leaders in those key services can see where the disparities are. But I think the whole protest now is about change, isn't it? And we don't want to be waiting for 3, 5, 10 years to see any change. So I would like to see a time when the minister will come on a call and point out what change has happened, what the improvement has been in the data, because that's where we really need to focus on now. And it seems to me, in the prison and probation service in particular, and the police, the BAME leaders in those organisations need to be listened to properly. There aren't that many senior BAME leaders in these organisations, and the ones that are there, I've spoken to many of them, they do want to be heard. They do want a platform, and I think that should be formalised within the organisation. I'm the vice chair of Equal. We have a national independent advisory group. A number of colleagues on the call today are members of that body. We've tried very hard for, I think, almost 6, 7 years now to move the dial with MOJ and HMPPS. We do work closely with officials. There are some very committed officials, but there are still too many officials at all levels who just do not get race equality. They often don't even know what land review is still in the service. So that's my test, really, when I go around to a prison and talk about land review, the recommendations, what's going on, use of force, incentives, adjudications. We just do not see enough focused action and external input to bring about the change. So I don't want to look at another report in 10 years, which tells me that young black people are more likely to be arrested by the police, more likely to be in custody, and are propping up the justice system. We've got to change that, and colleagues made a number of good points about stop and search. I'll finish by one quote I heard last week from a middle-aged black man in London in one of the calls that Jake mentioned with a deputy mayor for policing. He'd had a lot of bad experiences as a black male in London. He's a middle-aged man now with children. And he said, basically, he's got a son who's autistic. And when his son gets stopped and searched, he wants it to be a good one. And I had to challenge him to say, we cannot think like that. We cannot treat stop and search as a rite of passage for young black men in this country. I understand what he's saying, because he needs to prepare his child to deal with the police. But that's the mindset we've got now in our communities, and that cannot continue. Thanks, John.
Thanks, Jeremy. And again, as with all our other speakers, some points that we really must make sure that we capture and then pass on to the minister, because you're right, we can't be in this position in 3 years' time or 5 years' time, or in an even worse position than we're in that time. The time for action is now. Just before, I've got at least one person, James, who wants to come in. But before I bring James in, I'm just going to turn to our director, Nina, who I missed actually wanting to ask the minister a question, for which my apologies, Nina. But just hand over to Nina for a couple of comments, and then I will go to James Nichols. Nina.
Thanks, John. Yeah, I'll ask this question. I'll follow up with the minister, but it'd just be interesting to get the panel's views on it as well. And my question was going to be, do you agree that quality impact assessment, as are done as part of the public sector quality duty, should be both published and have greater teeth? I was going to ask him this particularly because his colleague Liz Truss in recent weeks had refused to publish the equality impact assessment for the Coronavirus Act, which gave police powers over the previous months, because she said it would have a chilling effect on on the civil servants that were writing those equality impact assessments. And my reason for asking is two of the quality impact assessments I've been looking at a lot recently. First of all, the one that was around suspicionless searches, Section 60 searches, indicates that it was likely to have a disproportionate impact on Black, Asian and minority ethnic people to make Section 60s easier, and yet that change went ahead. And secondly, there was a quality impact assessment recently done for the proposed changes to the Victims Code, which when we submitted our response, we felt would actually have a disproportionate impact on Black, Asian and minority ethnic victims, because, for example, information about restorative justice would only be the responsibility of the police, and yet that assessment acknowledged that there was mistrust between the police and many Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities. So I just wanted to get the panel's views on equality impact assessments. Should they be published and should they have more teeth?
Okay, panel members, what we're going to do is we're going to demute you all, because it would be quite clumsy to sort of ask you to signify that you wanted to come in. So we're going to demute you all. I'm not going to call you in any particular order, but who would like to say something about equality impact assessments?
I think, well, I've got, I'm very concerned about the equality impact assessments. Clearly they should be published. And I would like to see the Equality Act strengthened in relation to public authorities and the public sector equality duty, because there's no point doing equality impact assessments, one, if they're not acted upon by the public authority, and two, if we can't see them. So too many public authorities undertake equality impact assessments and just ignore them, as far as I'm concerned. So even when they show clear disparities, I'm sure the ones that you've mentioned do show the disparity. It has become a tick box exercise, and I just want to see better accountability for ministers through the Commission as well, to make sure that these are meaningful, because as we know, the Equality Act has not been transformational as far as I'm concerned for Black communities. It needs to be strengthened, and we need to be able to hold to account public bodies better than we do at the moment, because what difference do they make when you look at the disparities in the prison and probation service, for example, and policing?
Thanks,
I mean,
Jeremy.
I agree. I think they need to be done. I actually think a lot of the time it's not done, and sometimes it's voluntary sector organisations are saying, "Hang on, have you done an equality impact assessment?" And it shouldn't be for us to say that. They should automatically be doing it. And if they're not going to publish the results, then how can they be held accountable? And I think what probably needs to happen is some legal action taken against organisations and public bodies, because if they're not getting it right, and if they're breaching the Equality Act, there needs to be legal action, but then that costs money. So sometimes the only way sometimes someone listens is, I mean, how many times have we seen, for example, the government being taken to court? So if they're taken to court, but legal action is expensive, who's going to take them to court? The voluntary sector don't have the money. So I think that's the big problem here, that there is no accountability, really.
Thank you.
Yeah, I totally agree as well. I mean, we're in 2020 now. There shouldn't be a choice whether to publish those impact assessments. It should be mandatory. They should publish them, because as chilling as they may look, things are so critical in the community now that action to make changes is paramount. It's paramount. So, and to get that, even to start to build back that trust from the community, we have to see these assessments published so that we can look at what can be done so that improvements are made. So it shouldn't even be a choice. They should have to publish these equality impact assessments and make visible changes to bring better numbers, and it should be law. It's needed now. It's absolutely needed now, and I think the majority would agree with that. So that is something that is taken forward.
Thank you, Lorraine. Jake, I can see you want to come in.
Just quickly, because I think most people have said what I was going to say. I think for me, it's so important to understand who's determining the scope of them. because often they're done by people who perhaps don't fully understand all the ramifications on different equality groups. And also, if you're relying on existing data when in actual fact, as Shaista and Jeremy and others have pointed out, if you haven't got the data, you're not necessarily able to make a full assessment of the impact of things. And when it comes to things like police confidence, you know, they use the public attitudes survey, the Home Office crime survey, and it actually doesn't involve that many people at a borough level. So you don't really get an accurate picture. And really, often you have to go out and collect data from different communities to fully understand the impact on them. So I think they're usually flawed. They're usually done by people who haven't been properly trained in equality impact assessment. And as Jeremy says, it's sort of a tick box. I've sat on so many commissioning bodies that are meant to have EIAs in place, and it's usually just a paragraph. Oh, we've talked to various people in the community, and I'm thinking, how's that understanding impact? But anyway, I'll stop there. I think for me, an absolute overhaul of the Equality Act would be really useful, and I think we need to give different communities in this country the asset base and foundation and sustainable funding in order to be able to challenge on all of this. Because as Shaista said, if charities haven't got the resource to then hold public bodies to account, or as we know, the race equality organisations in this country have been weakened by lack of investment, then, you know, it does just become a paper exercise rather than anything meaningful.
Thank you, thank you. Right, colleagues, I'm going to now move to James Nichols, who wanted to come in, and remind you, if you'd like to come in at any part with either a question or a contribution, just put your name into the Q&A box and I will call you in due course. James.
Hello, can you hear me this time?
Very good.
Good. Thanks for letting me ask a question. So yeah, I'm from Transform Drug Policy Foundation, so our particular interest is obviously drug policy. So I apologise for taking 2 bites at the same cherry in this meeting. But I mean, I was at an event recently where Simon Woolley described drug policy as the sharpest tool in the box of police harassment. And we all know the data on stop and search, and we know the data on the role that suspicion of cannabis in particular plays as a stated reason for searches. And so I guess my question is that sense that Simon Woolley articulated, is that something that you, and this is maybe for Emmanuel in particular, have been getting from the people you've been speaking to? And what particular changes would people like to see on this specific issue of drug policy and drug policing? And as a kind of follow-up, I guess more widely, I mean, are there particular challenges in speaking on drug issues and drug policy issues as Black community organisations, given the bias and the stereotyping that we're all aware of? I mean, I'm conscious that an organisation like Transform's able to speak on these things in a particular way. Are there other challenges that we, for example, need to be aware of? So yeah, thanks.
Thanks, James. Emmanuel, can I come to you first? We need to make sure we demute Emmanuel. I can see he's still muted. That may be a problem technically, I don't know. Would any of the other members of the panel like to come in before we can re-establish contact with Emmanuel?
Do you want to kick off, Jake?
Yeah, as Emmanuel's not able to necessarily speak, so I know that the account group and the young leaders have talked quite a lot about this, and you know, the amount of times that I've heard that young people have been stopped because of the smell of cannabis. I mean, really? Is this how we want our police officers to be operating? So I think for me, I completely agree with Lord Woolley's position on this. I've always been an advocate of a total reform of drug policy. I think, you know, we are sensible enough as a world to realise that current policy isn't working. I think we can actually do something really quite progressive and radical in terms of the economy of drugs. because at the minute we have a drugs market that the foot soldiers bear the brunt of the violence and the illegality of drug supply. And I think so many other countries are way ahead of us. And I still can't understand why America and, you know, all that's wrong with America, the UK is lagging behind in our thinking. And it's, you know, I'm glad that Transform and others are still pushing on a radical agenda to have a sensible conversation about drug use that's based on reality rather than fantasy. But, you know, will we ever have a political government that's willing to, because everyone in opposition says they want to reform the drug, but then when they get into government, they suddenly go quiet on it. So I think for me, now would be a really good time to really have a radical rethink. And I do think the police should be, the ability of them to be able to use the smell of cannabis to stop and search people should be removed, frankly.
I couldn't agree more. I can see, Lorraine, that your hand is up. So I'm going to ask Jamie to demute you, which he's done, I think. Lorraine, over to you.
Yeah, there has been a lot of conversation around that, and moving. I mean, they should be. I think that they need to review that policy. I think that policy, there needs to be some changes, but I also think that there needs to be some training with the police officers. Just yesterday, sadly, we had a murder on the weekend, and I was speaking to a Black police officer, and he was just sharing with me how he interacts with the young people whilst he's in the community. And he was with a group of Black boys, about 3 of them, having a discussion around, you know, various challenges in the community. And then a police van drove up, and the boys said, right, they're going to come and stop and search us and harass us. So the Black officer said, no, they won't do that. Why would they do that? You're not suspicious in any way. They said, yes, they always do it to us. Just because of how we look, we're Black. They stop, search us, they manhandle us all of the time. I guarantee they're going to come, they're going to stop, because these boys are used to that. And they're not smoking, but it's just something which they're used to, a continual stop and search and roughing up. Now, the van stopped, and the police said to the officer, is everything okay? He said, yes, everything's fine. And they drove off. Those boys were in shock. They said the only reason why they didn't stop and harass us is because you're with us. Now, this officer said to me that if more officers are trained in the cultural diversity and knowledge around the Black ethnic community, it would help to change the perceptions. So I'm very, very keen on action. There needs to be training. Another young man, well, he's a bit older, not a youth. He doesn't smoke at all, doesn't smoke at all. He was stopped and searched, handled very roughly. I can say his name, Sage Holmes Lewis. And I got in contact with him. I said, Sage, what do you want to do about this? He said he wants to train the officers how they can conduct their stop and search in a positive way and not racially profiling so many Blacks that's happening. And do you know, I actually observed him delivering a training in New Scotland Yard, and it was predominantly white officers. There was only one Black officer there. And the reception, the engagement, the interest that these officers showed, there was such a level playing field of interest and wanting to learn. He'd done the training for a PowerPoint, but observing the training and how they received that, the questions that they asked. There was one English woman that said, that she hasn't grown up in an environment with any Black people at all. So coming to police in an area where there's predominantly Black, it's totally new to her. She doesn't know how to interact. She doesn't know what to expect. She obviously knows what the law is saying, but in terms of community relations, she's is fresh to her. And she was so grateful for that training. So as well as us reviewing the policies, making the changes, there needs to be action with training.
Brilliant. Thank you. And I love the passion, which is tremendously important. We can get just a bit too dispassionate on an issue where the time for passion is here. I'm going to go to Bruno Min from Fair Trials, who's posted a couple of questions. After that, our own Jamie Morrell has got a question. And then I will probably bring this session to a close. So Bruno, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. Hi, I'm Bruno from Fair Trials. We work internationally, but we do most of our work in Europe, where racial and ethnic collection in the criminal justice system is either very controversial for historical reasons or because of the many very worrying kind of right-wing governments there, or it's outright banned by law. But so it's a real challenge, I think, persuading people to kind of even consider this issue as a priority. But at the same time, I keep hearing in the UK and in the US as well, that despite the existence of data in the UK and several other countries, there's so little progress. So I'm just wondering, the merits of pushing for data collection in Europe, or how hard to push for this. I understand that it's, I think there's broad agreement that it's probably a good idea, but I just want to get a sense of how hard to push for this. And secondly, in the absence of racially disaggregated data in many of these countries, what does the panel think are the most effective ways of illustrating not only the existence of the problems of racial disparities, but also the scale? Thanks.
Okay, panel members, who would like to go first? Just either we'll demute you all, or you can demute you, or put a hand up. I can see Shaista.
I just want to quickly say that I think, I mean, I can see what's happening in Europe, and I think despite that, despite the types of governments that are there, we need to continue collecting data because the governments change, people at the top constantly change, and it takes time to collect data. You're not going to collect data overnight. To get trends, it might take you 3, 4, 5 years. But by that time, the government may be different. So I think it's still important to carry on pushing. And then when the time is right, then you can use that data.
Any other panel member?
I think clearly we all want to see useful, robust data that reflects the ethnic demographic of a population as detailed as possible. I think anyone who's worked on European programs and with member states realizes the frustration of trying to talk about race very often in the European context. But I think, in terms of employment data, unemployment data, crime data, these things are really important for, I would argue, for any society to look at as Jake talked about earlier, the equity of a society. Data is really important to illustrate that and see the evidence base for that. So you can, countries can take a colorblind approach, they can bury their heads in the sand, but they'll probably end up with serious ghettos and poverty and disturbances on a timely basis because they're just not acknowledging the problem, and they're foolishly thinking that they are fair when they're clearly not fair to every member of their country. So data is really important. Obviously, we're out the EU now, so we're probably going to have a lot less influence on that. But I'd like to make sure that this country is as good as it could be on data collection, and that we focus on the issues rather than the terminology and getting too hung up on what we call things. Let's just look at be as accurate as we can and take the action that we need to take and communicate why we're doing things and get people to buy into solutions and take responsibility.
Thanks, Jeremy. And
can I say quickly, slight diversion, if you don't mind. Terminology more generally, I think, is key. We're all still using the term BAME, and I think we need to not use it ever again, frankly, because I don't think it helps explain who we're talking about. So wherever possible, I'm getting used to it as well, because I used to use BAME all the time. But you know, saying African and Caribbean and being specific, because within every single broad racial category or ethnic category, there are so many different nuances. You know, I work in Hackney, and you know, you can't talk about the Turkish community. It has so many different facets, and I think we're not doing ourselves a favour if we use too many broad terms. So that's my first point. Secondly, you know, I really think when it comes to the police, they use the IC 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 way of categorizing people's ethnicity. I mean, IC2, dark European. That sounds like something out of the Dark Ages. What does that say about how they value people of different ethnicities? So I think for me, there's a broader question about terminology, and we should use this moment in time to start to nuance it and be more intelligent about how we talk about different communities. And I think that connects with data. I was surprised the other day, I'm part of the local health system in City and Hackney. Apparently ethnicity is not recorded on death certificates, so it's been difficult to fully understand the impact of COVID. I mean, I might be wrong there, but that's how I heard it at the meeting. I was shocked. So I think, to me, we need to look at how we use terminology, how we use data through the lens of equity, so that we create a system that actually tells us the reality, so that we're not having to fund loads of research projects that go away, spend a year, spend 400,000 or 500,000 to come back and tell us what we probably already knew anyway. So I think we need to get smarter about how we use data. What's great about technology is that now we don't almost have to rely on data to see where the problems are. And I you know, really appreciate all the efforts that people do to, for instance, when they film a stop and search encounter that clearly shows the police are not following their guidelines. We need to do more of that sort of stuff without obviously causing trauma, because everyone watching this stuff on a daily basis is, you know, people, we take it inside ourselves, and we have to be careful about that. But I think for me, it's about speed now. We expect answers quickly as a society. So for me, it's how we use data smartly in real time. And as Jeremy said earlier, if we're going to publish data, then government needs to be monitoring what impacts it's creating as a result of knowing that data, because data on its own is not very useful, frankly.
Thanks, Jake. Colleagues, I think we've probably run out of time because I just want to turn to Nina to give you all a short update from the CJA. But can I thank...
Do you mind if we just quickly bring in Donna? I know that she had her hand, that she just had a technical problem and wanted to come in. Just very short. I'll keep mine very short, and I do have a written up response that I can send around to everybody.
Okay. Sorry, yes, absolutely. I didn't see Donna's hand at all. Sorry about that. Donna.
Hi, good morning, colleagues. My question to the panel is this. I noticed when we listened to the Minister, Alex Chalk, talk earlier on, his comment about the fact that 5,000 of his constituents showed up after the death of George Floyd, for me was quite telling, because I'm finding in this current era that people are saying things to justify humanity. A case in point, when the black security guy carried the white guy who had come to London with some of Tony Robinson's mob, allegedly, and that was seen as exceptional. And for me, I think sometimes when we comment on these things in this way, we almost pay into the rhetoric that somehow human behaviour is exceptional. So I just wanted to kind of get you guys' feelings and comments on what he said this morning, because I thought that was very, very telling that, you know, he's got 98% white people in his constituency, but 5,000 of them came out when George Floyd died. Well, we're humans, no? So if there's loss of life, and if there's a loss of life as tragic as it being filmed globally, why wouldn't people feel lost? Why was their coming out exceptional? And for me, often it's these types of leaders in these spaces with that mindset that do most of the damage. I just want to get your thoughts on that.
Donna, that's a really important question and comment. And I was disappointed when we ran out of time for getting you to get your question to Alex Chalk, and it will be put to him. But in the last couple of seconds, I am going to invite the panel, any member of the panel, to make any response to that, and then very, very briefly go to Nina, and we'll be finished by 12:05. Jeremy, I can see, I don't know whether you've unmuted yourself or you've remained unmuted throughout, but I'm going to invite you.
Yeah. It made me think when I heard about Cheltenham that it wasn't too long ago that Lord John Taylor was rejected as a Tory candidate to be an MP, and the N-word was used, I think, by someone in that constituency party. So it's good to see Cheltenham's come on somewhat since then. I think Donna's right. I think, you know, I always judge people by their actions. So ultimately, I value seeing lots of people on the streets protesting, but for me, it's when they go back to their companies, their organizations, when they're on the transport system, how do they treat and view Black and Asian people, basically? And do they give them jobs? Do they give them opportunities? How are they supported? Do they get listened to? Do they now see Black and Asian people as individuals, not just groups of people who they don't connect with? So for me, it's about how people personally take responsibility for their own behaviors and how they interact with Black and Asian communities in this country, particularly in the workplace. So that's where I judge people.
Thank you. Shaista.
I think my worry is that although some of these incidents have galvanized lots of people are, you know, like the example that was given, I've noticed, you know, Facebook pages and people coming out of marches and so on and so forth. But I just feel that in 3 months and 6 months and 12 months, those people would have forgotten, you know, and I don't feel that these actions, these short-term actions are resulting in long-term attitudinal changes. And that's the worry. I think it's just a part of, you know, let's just get involved. It's just so massive on social media. So I think that's going to be the telling time. And I don't see these as long-term attitudinal changes at all.
And a final comment from Lorraine.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just going to be honest. When he came out with that, I was like, here we go again. I mean, he could have used that time to deliver some more impactful response to that question. Using those 500 people, bless them, as a reference because of how they responded was not what we really needed to hear in terms of what changes need to happen from his level to deal with the crisis we have at hand. So I'm just going to be honest, I would feel like, no, that's not what you should be saying. But I'm glad that there's a change there. But just like the others have said, is that a long-lasting change? There's so many issues that need to be addressed and transformation. And I think he could have used that time to say something more impactful.
Thank you for that. A sentiment with which I subscribe entirely. You know, I think Jeremy is also right. It's a question of what each and every one of us is doing next. That is the most important question here.